You're live on Facebook now? Good morning, and welcome to members of the media at our video conference here at our MSJ headquarters, San Fernando. And welcome as well to all of those of you who have joined us on Facebook Live. A very good Sunday morning to everyone. Today we want to address in this video conference a major development that took place over the last few days, which was the decision by 3 trade union federations, the Federation of Independent Trade Unions and NGOs, the Joint Trade Union Movement, and the National Trade Union Center, NATO, to collectively resign from the National Tripartite Advisory Committee. Now, this decision, according to government ministers, took the government by surprise, because the day before the decision by the trade union federations to resign, the government said there was a meeting of NTAC and everyone, including trade union representatives, participated. The trade unions have clearly outlined reasons why, and I'm not now going to address or speak on behalf of trade unions, because of course I don't. I speak on behalf of the MSJ. What I want to say is that this collapse of the National Tripartite Advisory Council is another example, a definitive example of the total failure of the leadership of Dr. Rowley as Prime Minister, and by extension of his PNM cabinet, to foster and arrive at consensus in Trinidad and Tobago with respect to key issues and problems that the country is experiencing, and therefore failure to arrive at consensus on the way forward. So we are putting the blame for the collapse of the NTAC squarely at the feet of the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Rowley, because it was in December of 2015, shortly after the PNM won the elections on the 7th of September 2015, that Dr. Rowley gave an important address to the nation, and as Prime Minister, in that address, he announced the establishment in the coming year, which will be in 2016, of the National Tripartite Advisory Council as a mechanism of bringing employers, that is business, labor, workers, and the government together to discuss how the country will deal with the economic problems and come up with consensus on the way forward. And this is why we are placing the blame for the collapse of NTAC squarely at his feet, because this was a specific decision announced by Dr. Rowley in December of 2015. This therefore was a creature of his own making. Now, I want to say that this is not the only example of the complete failure of initiatives by this government to develop policies and programs and actions in the interest of the people, which policies, programs, and actions will be based on consensus, on bringing different people together. The very first experience of that was the establishment of the Economic Development Advisory Board, which was established in late 2015. I myself was appointed to the Economic Development Advisory Board. And this board, of course, it wasn't managing any enterprise, so we all members of the board worked totally pro bono. We received no stipend or any other income and so on from this. It was public service by eminent persons wanting to contribute ideas and to give advice to the Prime Minister, because the EDAB was established to provide advice specifically to the Prime Minister, but also, of course, to come up with economic policies and ideas that would enable other government ministries and government programs to be effective. I was a member of the EDAB. And the second The second policy note that the EDAB sent to the Prime Minister was in January of 2016, just a few months after we were established. And what was that policy note on? It was on the issue of tripartite discussions. It was specifically giving advice to the Prime Minister with respect to how the National Tripartite Advisory Council ought to function. So the Prime Minister cannot say that he did not get very good advice about how the Tripartite Advisory Council ought to function. And so in January of 2016, the Economic Development Advisory Board sent a note to the Prime Minister on the confidential cover. I am not now going to necessarily break the confidentiality of the communication. Suffice it to say that what we proposed was that the NTAC deal specifically with coming up with consensus as a priority before they discussed trade union, labor law reform, and all those other issues, because labor law reform could always be discussed in other tripartite bodies. The Ministry of Labor, in fact, between 2015 and 2020, we have heard the then Minister, Jennifer Batiste-Prime, was boasting about how many consultations she held on minimum wages, on occupational safety and health, on Industrial Relations Act, on migrant workers policy, I believe, on a law to replace the outdated workers' compensation. She had a ton of consultations which were tripartite in nature. And therefore, we did not in the EDAB think that the primary and first task of the Tripartite Advisory Council should be to discuss labor legislation. We felt it needed to bring workers, representatives, labor, business representatives, employers, and government together to discuss how the country will get out of our economic crisis. How we will get out of the economic crisis. What would be the relative sharing of the burdens of adjustment that will have to be made? Because we recognize, and the MSJ subscribes to that view, that there are adjustments that have to be made. They have to be made in 2015, 2016, and they continue to have to be made. The problem is, who is bearing the burden of those adjustments? And that is where the tripartite process was critical. And we recommended a whole process whereby the business organizations and employers could say, this is what we are prepared to sacrifice to contribute to the country getting out of the crisis. And labor could say the same, and government could say the same. And therefore there will be consensus on the way forward. But the Prime Minister totally ignored the advice of the Economic Development Advisory Board. And this is why I'm saying today, without fear of contradiction, that the failure of tripartite lies squarely at the feet of Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley, Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. He failed to heed the advice of the EDAB on this issue and on many other issues, but I'm dealing specifically with tripartite today. Now, the EDAB collapsed in 2018. I myself resigned, I think it was sometime early April 2018. Dr. Terence Farrell, the chair of the EDAB, resigned in January, and there was no new appointment as a chair, and so I resigned in April. We received no communication from the Prime Minister or the other minister after Dr. Farrell resigned, so board members were there. We could not meet in the absence of a chair. We had no deputy chair appointed to that committee, and therefore I resigned in April, and right after that other members resigned, and the EDAB collapsed in April of 2018. And therefore a critical mechanism, a very important mechanism, that could have assisted the government outside of partisan politics and so on, to guide the government with respect to economic policy, that Economic Development Advisory Board collapsed, and I want to place the responsibility for that collapse squarely at the feet of Dr. Rowley, because he didn't even acknowledge the various notes that were sent to him by the EDAB. He did not acknowledge or engage us in any discussions on the notes that we sent. So the failure of the EDAB is squarely at the feet of the Prime Minister, Dr. Rowley. It's a failure of leadership Now, also in January 2018, you may have forgotten, I certainly haven't, that the Prime Minister appointed his blue-eyed boy from the employer class, one of the biggest business people in this country, Mr. Christian to head a 5-person committee that was supposed to be responsible for implementing the relationship and projects between the private sector and the government. Also on that committee were Mr. Richard Young, who happens incidentally to be the father of Stuart Young, very high-profile minister in the PLM government. Also on that committee was Mr. Blair Ferguson, a Mr. Shamir Mohammed, and a Miss Gloria Jones-May from Tobago. Now, since the appointment of that committee to now, which is 3 years, January 2018 to now, we have heard not a single word or report or recommendation coming out of that committee. So that committee has been a failure. And since it was appointed by the Prime Minister, one of his bright ideas and initiatives, we want to put the failure of that committee, whatever it could have done, we have no idea because we don't know what the terms of reference were. The terms of reference were never published or anything like that. Unlike the EDAM, the terms of reference were made public. The terms of reference of the NTAC was made public. But this committee, I don't think any terms of reference were ever made public. So we don't know what it was supposed to do, but in any case it did nada, nothing. Because there's never been a report. We've never seen any reference to it in budget statements by the Minister of Finance, or the Minister of Planning, or the Prime Minister, nothing. It was simply a public relations gimmick. In my view, it was to offset the fact that the EDAM had been sidelined, Dr. Farrell had resigned, and the EDAM was in a state of collapse. And so that was what that was. But significantly, the person on that chairing that committee, Christian Moutet, and we should not forget these people, because you see, people like Christian Moutet are controllers. And if I'm not mistaken, part of this huge merger that is taking place between major pharmaceutical distribution companies in Trinidad and Tobago, Christian Moutet is the head of one of those conglomerates that is involved in that merger. So when we come to discussing the burden of adjustment, we see very clearly that the business class in this country, particularly the big controllers of capital, have not had to share much of a burden personally. Their businesses may not have made as much profit, but we are sure that they have not shared much of a burden personally in terms of their lifestyle, in terms of their incomes, in terms of their maintenance of their assets and their properties, in terms of their maintenance of their US dollar accounts held in Miami, or their accounts held in London, or wherever they have put their money banked abroad when they engage in capital flight in this country. That elite, those controllers of big capital, have not shared the burden of adjustment in this country. In the same way that workers who have lost their jobs have no income, workers who have not had a pay increase since 2012 and facing rising prices, and food prices going up, transport prices have gone up, very soon pharmaceutical prices will go up, and so on. So workers, unemployed, poor people, people who have lost their jobs, people who have got no increase for the last 8 or 9 years in their pay packet, but facing much, much higher prices. They're the ones who have taken the burden of adjustment. And it was precisely that issue that the NTAC should have addressed. How do we share that burden equitably and fairly? But no, the government doesn't want that, because as far as the government is concerned, the big owners of management and capital will not have to share the burden in the same proportion as working people and poor people. Working people and poor people take pressure. That is the government's policy. And then, last year, 2020, shortly after COVID, we had this big announcement of a roadmap for recovery committee. 22 people, I think 1 or 2 were added subsequently, so they ended up being 23, 24. And they invited others on subcommittees, so we had a whole process engaged in the roadmap for recovery. But have we heard anything about that roadmap for recovery? Has the final report ever been published laid in the Parliament? And as far as I'm aware, there was an interim report that was circulating around the country middle of last year, around June of last year, May, June of last year, but I'm not aware that the final report has ever been laid in Parliament. Here what the Minister of Finance said, call it there, 5th of October 2020, in his budget statement, 2021. He said, when in discussing the issue of the recovery, economic recovery, he said, Madam Speaker, we recognize there is no clear path for the reopening of the economy. We are aware that the longer the economy stays at a less than optimal production level, the longer it will take to get it going again, and the more protracted the economic slowdown. Over the past months, utilizing local expertise and experiences, we have designed a post-COVID roadmap to recovery to assist us with guidance and advice on what we should do to meet developmental and growth objectives, and so on. Then goes on to say, the post-COVID economy will be shaped by decisions made in the fight against the virus, and so on. And he said, in particular, we can only avoid conflicts arising from the interplay of political and economic forces and make a planned and safe exit from the crisis through collective action at all levels of the society. In this regard, our political and economic institutions must cooperate to fight against the virus to collectively eliminate it. So here's in there talking about collective activity, collective actions at all levels of the society. But the Roadmap for Recovery Committee is a mystery, total mystery. Did the Roadmap for Recovery decide on what should be done with WASA? We doubt it. Did the Roadmap for Recovery decide what should be done with other organizations? We doubt it. So the government has gone about its own way, totally ignoring the kind of advice that it would have obtained and the ability to arrive at consensus. Look at what came out in the Guardian newspaper on Thursday, the Business Guardian. And this is something that is not new, because you have heard me speak many times about this, about transfer pricing by the oil energy companies, BP, Shell, Repsol, BHP, and so on. I've spoken about this on many occasions with respect to transfer pricing with natural gas and LNG, and the fact that this country has been ripped off of billions of dollars by the mechanism of transfer pricing. And we have called on the government as MSJ on many occasions to deal with transfer pricing. So this is not new, not new. But the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean publishes a report saying that there was some $18 billion LNG scam. That's the headline, 18 billion LNG scam. So ECLAC makes a statement, it gets big headlines, MSJ makes a statement, and we are not taken as seriously. But we were making this point for years. We have been saying for years that this government is losing in tax revenue anywhere between $8 and $15 billion a year, and that has been going on now for the last 15 years. I reported even what the Minister of Finance told me about the size of the tax loss. So, 18 billion LNG scam. The Minister of Finance himself, in several budget speeches, shortly after he became Minister of Finance, spoke about the need for the government to get policies to deal with transfer pricing mechanisms. And he was getting advice from the IMF and others to deal with it. So he himself has spoken about it in budget speeches. But what has he done? Nothing. And yet, they closed Petrotrin down when Petrotrin never received a cent in subsidy from the government. Not a single cent was put in from taxpayers into Petrotrin. Not a cent. Not a single cent. What happened in the last 2 or 3 years of Petrotrin's operations? is that Petrotrin was unable to pay its taxes. But the amount that Petrotrin had not paid, and I was on the review committee, remember the last week committee, which submitted our report in June of 2017. This was a copy of it. And we had a table, and Petrotrin up to June of 2017 or thereabouts was owing, well, there was differentiation on, Petrotrin had one figure of how much tax it owed, Ministry of Energy or Ministry of Finance had a different figure. Ministry of Finance said 3 billion, Petrotrin said they owed 1.3 billion. Split it down the middle, Petrotrin probably owed about $2 billion in 2017. When it was closed down, it may have owed a bit more. Certainly not much more than $3 billion. So you closed down Petrotrin because it hadn't paid $3 billion in taxes, never received a cent in government subsidy, was paying all of its debts. Every single debt payment Petrotrin was meeting. Petrotrin was contributing immensely to the economy by way of employing workers, earning foreign exchange, providing fuel on the domestic market at a local price, and so on. Subsidizing LPG or cooking gas at no cost to the taxpayer. All of that Petrotrin was doing. Supporting other businesses in South that provided goods and services to Petrotrin. But it closed down Petrotrin, maybe because it owed $3 billion in taxes, but you wouldn't do a damn thing about Shell, BP, Repsol and the others who have ripped us off of $18 billion. 6 times that, and I feel it's more than 18 billion, but 6 times what Petrotrin may have owed in taxes. But you closed down Petrotrin for that, and you ain't do a damn thing about Shell, BP, Repsol, BHP, and the others. That is what this government is about. So, I just want to end by repeating that the failure of the Economic Development Advisory Board, the non-functioning, as far as we are aware, of that private sector implementation project committee headed by blue-eyed boy Christian Mute, one of the big controllers of this country, the failure of the National Tripartite Advisory Council, the total silence by the government with respect to the economic roadmap for recovery plan, and we fear as well the committee chaired by Mr. Anthony Watkins that is looking at dealing with urban social crises, that committee is also going to result in failure. All of that, together with the supporting of the controllers of big capital, foreign capital, and big local capital, while you're putting the pressure, the burden of adjustment on the backs of working people, the poor, unemployed, self-employed, small business people, and so on. All of that is at the doorstep of the Prime Minister of this country, Dr. Rowley. His leadership has failed this country in that regard. Questions? Yvonne? You okay? Okay, thank you. Hollis?
You did it.
Phil?
You did it your way.
Well, thank you very much for joining us in this video conference this morning. Let me just close by saying that we are not simply about criticism, because I say that note on the tripartite process that the EDAM put forward, I had a part to play as other members of the board did. So we were contributing, I was contributing as leader of the MSJ, I was contributing best as we could. Trade union leaders were contributing. JTOM put out a document called Labour's Economic Alternative Plan, LEAP, so that nobody could accuse MSJ or the Labour movement, I'm not speaking for them, but can't accuse the Labour movement of not making proposals on the way forward.
But I think it's Camille Robinson-Regis who's saying that they should come back. Do you think that there's any going back to that tripartite arrangement?
I don't see
it. Would it serve any purpose?
I don't see that. You see, The government has already said that they want to deal with WASA, and they already have their report. So what's the point of going back when you already decide what you want to do? That's Mama Guy.
There's nothing to go back to.
Like Mama Guy. And the issues of WASA, all the state enterprises, all of those things could have been part of the agenda of the NTAP from 2016 to now. That's 5 years. 5 years have passed. If they had taken the advice, the Prime Minister had taken the advice of the Economic Development Advisory Board on how this process should have operated. Yes? If the government had taken the advice of the Lashley Committee, of which I was a member with respect to restructuring Petrotrin, then workers would still have their jobs, maybe not every single one, because there may have been some voluntary separation where some people would have left, and so on. I don't know. There will be some restructuring, yes, but Petrotrin will still be functioning, refinery will still be up, there'll still be economic activity going, etc., etc. If the government had taken advice with respect to so many other things that the EDAB was working on, there will be projects going with respect to economic diversification. Nothing is happening with diversification of the economy. The economy, and all the government is doing is spending money on buildings and highways. That doesn't diversify the economy, doesn't create sustainable jobs, doesn't earn foreign exchange, doesn't save foreign exchange, will not help to get us out of the problems that we have. And many of the private sector companies are doing the same nonsense, building malls. Malls not going to help us. Malls don't earn foreign exchange. Malls burn up foreign exchange because they're importing things to put in the malls to sell. But that is the model that the government is going down. It is a neoliberal model, as we say, and the neoliberal agenda or policy agenda results in more poverty, more inequality, greater wealth for the wealthy. And so the burden of adjustments gets shared in that way so that a few benefit and the many suffer. And what we need in the country are policies for the many, not for the few. That is social justice, which is what the MSJ is about. Okay? Thanks. We also did our own roadmap for recovery as well, which we produced, I think, around the 6th of May, I think it was, last year. And we are the only political party that put out a roadmap for recovery. Very detailed document. So nobody could say we haven't contributed ideas for the forward development of this country. Thank you.
Yeah,